hello everyone. I'm super excited to be here in one of our beautiful Gable spaces in Hotel Emblem to kick off our Thought Leader series on the future of work and workplace. So with me, I have Brandon from the Liveramp, Chief People Officer. Super excited to have you here.
Likewise, Liza.
And today we're going to talk about a lot of things, so stay in tune. So let's dive in, right into it. So first thing, what was your remote work strategy before COVID, and how do you see it play out after COVID?
Yeah, well, it's a good place to start. And I'd open up by saying a couple things. One, I'm glad we're having this conversation because it's certainly something we've been thinking a lot about at Liveramp, and I know it's something that organizations of almost any type and size all over the world have been thinking about too. And even though we're a year into the pandemic, and even though Liveramp has been planning and thinking around the future of work for even in the years before that, our thinking has certainly evolved over the last year. And we'd be the first ones to say, with all humility, we're still learning. So conversations like this are a great opportunity to share what we think we understand and what we're doing, what we hear from our employees, from our customers, but really part of a much broader conversation. And for context on a lot of the things I'll share to your question, I'll talk really briefly about Liveramp, just so folks have a sense of the kind of contours of the company.
Definitely.
So Liveramp is a data connectivity platform, B2B software as a service, headquartered in San Francisco, but very distributed for a company of its size. We have 1,200 employees all over the world, 4 continents, 8 countries, and 13 offices. And so again, for a company of our size, we've been somewhat distributed for some time, long before the pandemic. And so before COVID, and despite all of that distribution, 95% of our employees worked in one of our offices, one of those 13 offices, and maybe 5% were permanently remote. And one of the things we found really useful, really important, especially over this last year, is to align on terms, right? And so at Liveramp, when we talk about remote, we're talking about not simply folks who work from home sometimes, we're talking about the portion of our workforce that works from home all the time, not in commuting distance of an office. And that was about 5% of our team. With the pandemic, even 12 months later, that's flipped on its head almost entirely. Almost 95% of our workforce is working from home all the time now, what we call remote. Some of them are close to our offices, but they're not.
But still remote.
That's right, yeah. So what's been powerful about that from a learning point of view is that we have now the vast majority of our workforce operating in a posture which before was a kind of minority experience at the company, which I think has built a tremendous amount of empathy.
Definitely.
And I think that'll serve us well long after the pandemic.
Definitely. One of the things that we talked about briefly before, but I would love for you to share, is actually how did you see the transition to 95% of your workforce is now fully remote. How do you see this going forward in terms of even how to plan the strategy for it? Where do you start?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say before the pandemic, Liveramp's remote worker strategy, like if you think about the experience of being a remote worker at Liveramp before, I think folks would tell us, and we know because we asked, it was fine, right? Like it was fine. But I think that we would also hear things like, I don't feel completely connected. And it was more than just the human connection. It was also like, I don't always have a clear sense of what's going on. Or I get the impression that folks who do work for one of our offices, particularly our San Francisco office, just understand what's happening at a level that I don't, because of how information is shared or not shared, the mediums that are being used, and so on.
Definitely.
And so these are some of the things we heard, up through a year ago. And then again, like almost the entire company, started working in a totally distributed fashion. So, in some cases, they say, necessity is the ultimate driver of creativity and progress. That was certainly true for us because overnight we had to think very differently about even basic things like how to communicate, how to transmit information, how to get feedback, like how to understand what's going on and what folks' needs are, even other things like, understanding different forms of productivity. For a company like ours, as a software business, a lot of that I think scaled pretty well to being distributed, these different measures of productivity, but a lot of these other elements of the employee experience we had to rethink. How do we really understand what's going on and make sure we show up in the right way for our people?
And even, I think one of the things is actually transparency, even, just thinking about that. But how are you, in this new world, how do you encourage creativity and collaboration and even increasing productivity with people that are only 100% working from home at this point?
Sure. Well, like a lot of companies, we saw a spike in productivity in the first 6 months, of the pandemic. But like a lot of other companies, we thought we understood what the drivers of that were, and they were not drivers that you could count on indefinitely, right?
Sure.
It's
even though it's nice.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the good news is, we're so proud of how our team showed up for each other over this last year. Like folks have worked in some cases around the clock to help make sure Liveramp didn't just survive the pandemic, but actually could continue on our growth trajectory. We've been a high growth software company for our first 10 years, and we don't have any intention of that stopping anytime soon, right? But that really kind of changed our sense of what we were playing for. And that was something, if we did anything right in those early months, it was to keep our eye on our ultimate aspiration and to remind ourselves that our people are the driver of all of that. So we've got to do right by each other, we've got to take care of each other, and then of course there's just a ton of what I would call everyday heroism. Just figuring out how do you actually do that, at a time when, folks don't see each other in person. And what have you. So it's a little bit of the, kind of the background on what that looked like. But again, I think the ultimate driver, a lot of that early creativity came from just the sheer necessity of having to do more than just survive. How do you thrive at a time when, things are unusually challenging?
And what are the perspectives that you identified that, those are the things that we need to design for in our remote work strategy for people to actually thrive in it, and exactly not survive and just, keep afloat, but really how do we make this as even a strength of the company as opposed to just implementing what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. In that effort, and again, this is another place where we'll, everything I'll share with a ton of humility because we're still learning, but I can certainly speak to the approach.
Yeah.
So, we know that before the pandemic, Liveramp, didn't necessarily have a structured remote work product, if that makes sense. We had people who worked remotely, right, but not necessarily someone who woke up every day thinking about how to make that experience amazing.
Definitely.
And connected to the types of working models that were prevailing at the time, primarily in the office. We had a fairly flexible model for folks in the office before as well, and designed a good bit around that. Now, right, in the 6 and 12 months ahead, we know our team's going to be even more geographically distributed than before, and in that working model kind of dimension, also much more diverse than before. We'll have folks that maybe came into the office, 4 or 5 days a week before, and maybe they come in 2 or 3 after. That doesn't sound like a big change, but it actually, in our understanding, it really is, right? So we really have to design and redesign for that. And then, of course, like we already talked about, we will inevitably have a bigger fraction of our workforce that's working remotely permanently as part of our overall strategy. We kind of branded it. We've been talking about future of work. Definitely. Right, at Liveramp, and when we talk with our folks and we're gathering insight, it's all under this kind of banner of future of work at Liveramp.
What are the benefits that you see? What are the benefits that you see in terms of even employee talent retention? Maybe it's even a downside, but let's talk about talent actually.
Yeah, of course.
The fact that we discussed it, I think you mentioned that Liveramp actually grew 25% during COVID. So how do you see in terms of the opportunities that actually remote work or the future work, as we say,
sure.
Gave to Liveramp?
Sure. Well, I can talk about it in 2 ways. One, we can talk a little bit about some of, I think, what I'd call the kind of absolute benefits or opportunities, and some of the relative opportunities. So, on an absolute basis, one of the things we've seen loud and clear the last year, and this, I think, affirm something we already believe, but now we've really operationalized it. Is that, you know, and for so many of our roles and so many of our teams, like there is brilliance everywhere. Like we have been able to find extraordinary talent for so many of our teams in places where we wouldn't have said we couldn't have before, but nonetheless we're not actually actively looking.
Yeah.
And that's true within the U.S. and it's a big country, right? And we had 7 or 8 offices. We will moving forward, but there were so many places where we weren't actively recruiting, and now for so many of our jobs during COVID, we've in many cases been recruiting from a national market. That's been extraordinarily helpful. Like that helps with not only the range of folks. We can be especially picky, right, when the pool starts that much broader. It's also been a huge driver of diversity in every form, right? Demographic diversity, intellectual diversity, diversity of the types of companies that folks are coming from, which also really helps. We're far from finished as a company, right? And so being able to continue to bring in folks and that fresh perspective is a huge part of what drives us forward. And being able to be more flexible in our talent attraction strategy really helps with that.
And I think at least for me also, one of the things that I always assumed that when you try to hire people, you just bring them to the office, you show them around this fancy place, and you sell them on this, right? So how do you see this change basically when you hire remotely? That you really need to make people believe in the company, right, and not just the benefits that it can offer.
Sure.
So how do you see that?
This is absolutely another place where the pandemic has challenged us to be even better.
Definitely.
Right? It's like that experience of doing your on-site or your final interview in a Liveramp office was we designed that to be a phenomenal experience. It's even like the little things of we'd send you like a coffee gift card the day before, so that's one thing you didn't have to worry about. You could just get yourself some coffee on your way to your Liveramp on-site interview. So all good. However, when you go to that office, the look and feel and the energy, right? The energy of being in a Liveramp office has always been something that candidates talk with us about when they're telling us, well, what made you confident in saying yes to Liveramp when you get the offer? And this is one of the things that comes up. And just like you said, we don't have that right now.
Yeah.
And we've still been quite successful bringing folks into the company, but that didn't happen overnight or by accident. What we found is that office can be a proxy for certain things that are really important for candidates. Is this a company that's healthy and going somewhere? Is this a place that is energizing? For me, is this a place that invests in its people?
Yeah.
Right. And so when you go to the office and you have that experience, you see proxies of that. None of those are actually necessarily perfect answers to any of those important candidate questions. And so what we've focused on over the last year and are still working on is, how do we not just show telegraph that to candidates, but really make it real for them, right? And just we have taken a whole other turn or whole other pass on all of the materials that we use with candidates, whether it's on our careers page, how we talk about ourselves on social media, just being that much more clear and concentrated in our message, and that much more specific about how a value around growth and opportunity at the company, how practically does that show up? And in some cases, some of the most effective ways to do that have been just amplifying the voices of our existing employees so that candidates can hear directly from our people.
So basically you see this now becoming a strength of, really bringing out the company's culture than opposed to, okay, we have nice offices, that's it, but you are actually joining something bigger.
Well, that's right. Well, and in doing so, it ends up being more inclusive too, right? Because a lot of the ways that we have now, started showing folks, in different, whether it's through employee anecdotes and stories, or the way we've redone some of our, portions of our career site, what have you, it's just richer, right? We haven't had, right, the offices to help tell that story, but it's helped us make all of the other ways we would think to do that stronger, and that's good, right? Because we were hiring all kinds of folks from different places before, and we will after too. And no longer is being in a Liveramp office for your interview. We have other ways, right, of delivering and communicating the culture.
Definitely. So we talked a lot about good things, but what about challenges? What challenges have you seen in this transition of most of your workforce remote? Maybe a little bit about employee retention that we hear quite a bit, or any other things that you would like to share, and how did you address them?
Sure. Gosh, I could talk all day about challenges. Yeah, plenty. It's been a challenging year, right? And
definitely.
like plenty of technical challenges, like just figuring how to reconfigure many parts of how the company operates for the world that we're in and then the world that we're going. So, but I also say lots of human challenges. And this is one of the things that I think we've acknowledged and that we work really hard to lead with, is this notion that there wasn't a firm barrier between someone's personal life and work life before COVID. That's even more obvious now. And as challenging as it is to be scaling a company under these conditions, a lot of our folks have things that are a lot more challenging going on at home, right? Whether it's around family members who might be vulnerable to COVID, or kids who've been like zooming into school for like a year now. Like there's just so much that can be weighing on our people. That we consider that a challenge, and we don't ask folks to dismiss that. We don't trivialize it. It's part of what we think we need to design around, and it's incredible. It's not surprising, but it is powerful to see how valuable it simply is to acknowledge and to show your team, right? To show your people that you understand like the fullness of what they're experiencing. And there will always be limitations to what the company can then solve for. Definitely. As it relates to a person's entire experience and all of the challenges and what have you. But the sheer acknowledgement, right, that there's more going on, than what may be taking place during work hours, and that all of that can affect how someone shows up at work, and that we're doing what we can, right, to make sure that Liveramp is a place where folks can continue to do great work, and that acknowledges what's going on. Like that's really powerful. So big challenge, but that's an approach that we keep hearing over and over again is really helping. And then on the employee retention side, while we haven't seen like a material uptick in attrition during COVID, we also don't take that for granted. The talent market for so many of the roles that we have at Liveramp, I think, is as hot now as it's ever been. And you can see it in the economy. You can even see it in the markets, right? Like, portions of the equities markets that have done unusually well over the last year in technology. There's a lot of venture, every part. Like there's a lot of venture capital money going into tech startups. There's a lot of growth. We've seen some really extraordinary IPOs of tech companies over the last year. So those are all, it really does underscore, right, that for a company like Liveramp, we can take nothing for granted. We want to stay out front, right, on the experience we deliver, on every part of the employee experience. And so we look at things like retention as like a lagging indicator of some of those things, but we also don't take for granted that we're in a really competitive market. And competitive or less competitive, we also think that a lot of the things we're working to do they're just the right thing to do. And the last thing I could talk about is kind of this distinction between productivity and creativity on the topic of challenges.
Definitely.
Right? Are we able to be productive in this kind of new way of working and what have you? Like that transition over the last year, I think, has been fairly successful. What I hear a lot from our folks in terms of challenge in this particular posture is more on that creativity, right? It's in the parts of our business, and there are a lot of them, right, where we're not running a established playbook. We're building new things, or we're overhauling something, right? And it's like, a lot of the ways that teams would naturally think to do that building or rebuilding, we have to rethink the modalities, the process. How do you make sure you're involving the right people? Optimistic there too, because a lot of the things that we're starting to find that will work will really serve us well, not just during a pandemic, but it's certainly been challenging.
On that, actually, I think that one of the things that I hear a lot is effectively that there is still magic and in-person creativity collaboration. How do you see this as come into play, especially I think with people that are fully remote and will remain fully remote, but also how do you see the offices that you still have come into play in that for such a dispersed team, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So in total transparency, I'll share a part of that that I think we've got a good view on for Liveramp, and a part of it I don't know that we figured out yet. So the part I think we're moving in the right direction is, unlike some technology companies, we are not enabling permanent remote work for all roles across our team. Will be for some, but it's going to be very specific, right? And for others, less so. Lots of flexibility, but this notion that we do want like a huge portion of our workforce to still be in commuting distance of an office and to have some regular presence in the office, because to answer your question, we do believe in the power of like in-person collaboration. We also realize though that the office doesn't by itself make that so, because we have even in a it's interesting, even before the pandemic, in a world where let's say 100% of our employees were coming into an office, we were also still distributed, right? So like, getting stuff done together was already a fairly distributed effort, if that makes sense. And so a lot of the things that we found challenging then are still challenging now, and we still need to solve for them for the future. But from a human connection point of view and the energy, we survey our folks regularly. We've been focus grouping a ton over the last year. Yeah, we keep hearing from a lot of our folks that a huge portion are really eager to spend some time in the office, and they value the flexibility, and maybe it's not 5 days a week or what have you, but nonetheless really want to have that opportunity. And even then, we haven't talked about the kind of career opportunity piece of that, which I'd be happy to talk about. For the the growing portion of the Liveramp team that'll be remote beyond the pandemic, that's the place I don't know if we've completely figured out like how to proxy some of the benefits of being in person from a connection point of view. We've done some incredible events and experiences over the last year, which have been all virtual and like just incredibly produced, like incredibly well conceived, and very well received, right, by our people. And so the question there is, when you have like a mixed audience, some folks in the office and some folks remote, like how do you keep that magic? Because some of our most successful events, coincidentally, I think in Liveramp history, have actually been the last year in this all virtual format, which, if you told us a year ago, we would have said would be a really big compromise. And so there's something really interesting there that we just want to pay attention to, because we see something special going on there. We just want to make sure we capture it. And a specific example of that, by the way, in terms of modes, like when you have some folks working in the office and some folks working from home, is, we're thinking through new practices, some of which I think are actually like maybe a little provocative, or at least really different than what our team would have been used to. And I'll give you an example. So, fast forward, hopefully everything goes great. Imagine in 6 months' time, a lot of Liveramps offices are reopened. And imagine a bunch of our people are now back in those offices, but also a bunch of our people are still working from home. And we're doing our first company all hands in the new era, right? How does it work? Right.
Exactly.
I'll tell you, our prior way of doing things was we'd have everyone in our bigger offices like San Francisco, New York, London, so on, would kind of get together. And in San Francisco, that's where a lot of the speakers would typically be. A lot of our leadership teams in San Francisco, so that would be kind of like the closest thing to like the live version, right? And or at least the in-person version. And then everyone else would be Zooming in effectively. That was not an awesome experience for folks that were Zooming in. Like the AV wasn't necessarily set up to do that, and like the content was always good, and we worked on inclusiveness and accessibility to the content pre, during, and post those all hands. But just the actual live experience, was somewhat mixed. Okay, great. We've gotten great feedback during the last year about kind of we've just been producing for one modality, right? It's like everyone's on Zoom every month together, and so all of our design efforts have been around this one modality, and so like the cycle of continuous improvement on that has been pretty good. And so really specifically, when we do our first all hands, when our offices reopen, we'll be asking the whole workforce effectively to Zoom in on their own devices, even if you're in an office. Imagine that, right? First all hands, you're still on your device, right? So that's like, we're thinking about that, versus having it, kind of pulling together and having that mixed modality again. So we haven't landed our answer per se, but it's an example of the type of thing we're thinking about.
I think throughout all of our conversation, one of the things that I really like that you always say was still learning, and you're iterating and really thinking about this as a product, as opposed to, okay, there is something we just need to solve for this and that's it, but really thinking of a holistic view. And one of the things that you touched upon, and I think it is a challenge that I don't think that we still have an answer to, is how do you actually measure the performance of employees that are either coming to the office on an everyday basis and people that are remote full time. I think that would be part of the challenges of the hybrid remote workplace. How do you actually know that what is the contribution of each person? How do you measure this? But also how do you help them grow in opportunities that are equipped for them and their work environment effectively.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing there is, we can talk a little bit about kind of understanding performance and scaling performance in a distributed model, especially remote. And then two, like how to think about growth, like the growth of the person, right? The two things are obviously related, performance and growth. Let's start with performance. So again, I think Liveramp is helped by just the nature of our business. As a software business, so much of the work we do, there's just a lot of things are dashboarded, established KPIs and metrics that can be pretty well established and then pretty well tracked.
Yeah.
So that's something that's a little structural to Liveramp that I think is wind at our back, and that has helped us as so much of our team has gone remote over the last year. But I would say even then there are two ingredients that I think are helpful for any business, and they're just like good kind of management practices, right? The first is just like crystal clear clarity on what the business needs from each person. So at Liveramp we use the OKRs, or objectives and key results format. Every single person in the company has them. They're linked to their team's objectives, ultimately linked to the company objectives. Places where those are aligned and clear, that's part of the pact, right, between a Liveramper, as we call them, and their manager, and really their whole team, right? Because they're not just accountable to their manager, they're accountable to their broader team. So it really starts there, and that sounds so basic, but we've all worked at places where that hasn't actually been clear, or where it's clear on some teams and not on others, and no one will claim perfection at Liveramp either on that count, but we know what matters, and it's something we want to be really dialed in, ultimately all over the company. There's a second thing, which is ultimately just trust. It's ultimately just trust. Where trust does not exist, no matter how many dashboards or KPIs or goals you have, there's always room to micromanage or doubt, or managers can get into behaviors that just communicate, like, I just simply don't trust you. Employees are we're all very perceptive. We pick up on that immediately, and it's incredibly counterproductive, and it's something we talk a lot about with our managers as well, is like, at the end of the day, like, there's no amount of data that can guarantee or tell you for sure that someone's doing exactly what you think they should be doing, and so you have to set the system up. It's not like don't have goals. You should have goals, get signal, understand progress, but at the end of the day, like, you hired someone to do a job. We say we have no small jobs at Liveramp. We think we hire amazing people, and we need to let them exercise, right? Mm-hmm. To be able to like have a little space and do what they do. And when they don't, when any of us, myself included, aren't sure exactly how to approach something, a part of the culture that we're trying to foster as we grow is to be able to raise your hand and say, I'm not sure. I know we'll figure it out, but I don't know what to do right now.
I think it is probably something that will evolve, really, how to make everybody feel that, first of all, the visibility of what they do in different personas and different roles, and how to make sure that it is something that is inclusive to all people in different types of either countries or locations in the company or anything like that. And I think that it is a huge challenge, but I do like that you're already thinking about this as a going forward step. Let's get back to remote work and the fact that, let's say now 95% are remote, but you're still keeping your offices, right? Or how do you see this in terms of the cost effectiveness of, there's so many articles talking about the how much remote work saves for employers.
Sure.
Per employee, but is it really something that you take into consideration? How do you see this going forward? Is it a cost that might even change its purpose, basically?
Yeah. Let's say a couple things on that topic. At Liveramp, we've always talked about the workplace strategy enabling, right, the workforce strategy and enabling the business to grow, right? Liveramp is a high growth business. It's not the type of business where your kind of success is driven by like how much cost you can trim from every part of the business. It's if we grow the top line, right, we delight our customers, we're shipping new products, we're solving new problems, a lot of the rest follows, if that makes sense. And so it's like kind of like this kind of question of like, what's the head and what's the tail, right? What leads what, right? Our workplace strategy is in service of those other things, the business strategy, the top line growth, the customer success.
Definitely.
And so when you start with that, then a lot of the other pieces become clear on the question. So it is true that Liveramp we're going to reopen our offices. We still think those matter. Now, we will not need to take up new space, like we thought we were going to, and that kind of deflection of cost is very, very significant.
For sure.
The last thing I would say on this, though, is that we're not necessarily taking all of that savings to the bank, right? Because part of what's enabling that is we'll have a huge fraction of our workforce that's coming in the office, but less often. We want to make that experience amazing for them.
Yes.
And we're going to have a bigger fraction of our workforce that's working remotely, permanently. And we want that experience to be amazing. And so even during the last year, we enhanced the kind of remote work program that supports home office equipment and ergonomics.
Yeah.
So the two together, we call it Ramp Remote, right? And it's like a lot of things we've talked about. Like we're really trying to think about it like a product. Understand your user, get regular feedback, like ship a version with a feedback channel. Understand the drivers of both customer satisfaction and cost, right? And tune those over time. So we've got Ramp Remote, right? We actually enhanced that over the last year.
Okay.
And so whatever it looks like, we're in V2 right now, we're going to ship V3 when the offices reopen, and folks who are temporarily remote, some of them will become permanently remote. We'll ship V3 and inevitably, whatever that looks like on a per person basis, that program will be delivered at a cost that's higher than the very, very kind of beta version or lightweight version that we were operating within before the pandemic. And that's by design. Right, because we want that experience to be amazing. That's going to be a bigger slice of my team's customer, which are our own employees, and what we work to understand in the spirit of being, fiscally responsible is just the spread between the traditional workplace costs, if those folks would have been in the office, and the cost of, servicing their remote work experience. Yeah. And no matter how you cut it, no matter we've cut it at least, like it's significantly less costly. But the big point is we're not aiming to, take 100% of the traditional office savings to the bottom line. We want to reinvest a portion of it in that remote experience.
So basically, yeah, I think your biggest product is your employees, right? So how do you make the experience for them the best? Yeah. In that sense, and maybe if you would like to touch a little bit about what do the employees that are fully remote, what do they want? What do you see them as like their biggest needs? Sure. Besides, of course, at least for me on a personal level, I've been remote, like all our team is remote. We hired remotely. Some of our team members I've never even met in person, besides Zoom to Zoom. And there are a lot of things that we can do on the home office front, but I have a 9-month-old baby at home, and no matter what equipment at home, it will not mask her crying or something like that. So I would love to hear from you a little bit about what you see people that are permanent remote workers, what do they need? How do you address that as well?
Yeah, you bet. What we've heard a couple things over the last year, and then as we start to be able to communicate more of like, what's going to happen once the offices reopen, we're getting, I think, what I would say our next round of insight from our employees as they start thinking about, for their personal situation, remote work less as a temporary thing and maybe as something that will be, the kind of part of their long run experience. So in the first wave, we heard about things that we've already kind of, been working to address through our Ramp Remote programs. That'd be things like, making sure folks have the right equipment, making sure, the decisions around, would you subsidize my internet if I had to upgrade my connection? Ergonomics, right? It's like the wellness. It's like the human-machine interface, like making sure that people are well and healthy, right? Sure. In their work setup at home, which does require design and thoughtfulness. That was all first round. Now, some of the things we're starting to hear as folks think about this as more of a permanent thing in some cases, it's like I like my home office now. I feel supported, I feel healthy. Like it's not like, my shoulders aren't tight. Like all that's great, and so I feel good there. I think we have, good tools and what have you. But now two new types of requests. One is actually around more I would call creativity tools. It's like, help me understand how can I it's like the whiteboarding and the sticky noting, and I'm missing that. And there are some pretty good distributed work tools for that, and we're looking at those. That's great. The other thing we're hearing though is, I like my home office, but I kind of like to get out every once in a while. Like, what are my options there? Should I just be sure I'll be working from a coffee shop? But sometimes that's noisy. Can I be working how does Liveramp want me to think about that?
Definitely.
And that's the place where we're probably least ahead, where we haven't thought through it as much. We think we've got a little time to figure it out, but it's certainly something where we're starting to get some signal, and we know that that's certainly part of the puzzle that we want to have thought through before we reopen our offices.
Definitely. I think that it's interesting what you throughout everything that we talked about. I think one word that stood out to me a lot is also flexibility. Effectively, you really need to iterate and be flexible in how you think about it, in terms of the next steps, but also in terms of the office, what people need, how do they see this going forward. So maybe what is flexibility in your eyes going forward in all of this different types of channels?
Sure. If we've done anything right over the last year, it's part of around communicating expectations right to our folks, and so we try to bring in external research and some just helping folks have a rounded view of what's going on and what's informing our thinking, because a lot of the signal we're getting that's helping us understand what's right for Liveramp for future of work comes from our own people, and then we round that out by thinking how are other companies approaching this, and how do we stack benchmarked wise on certain offerings that we have and what have you. And then, within all of that, flexibility, right? What you mentioned, it's one of the things that we design for. Anything that we think we have a firm handle on today, we're humble enough to know, could change. And so, particularly in times like these, it's very valuable for a team like Liveramp to try to build flexibility into, every product we ship internally, but also every outside relationship we have, whether it's with a landlord, whether it's with a technology or tool vendor or a partner.
For sure, and I think that's probably the key, in a sense, that how do you see this? And I think I am sure that if we'll even talk in a month, you'll see more and more things, more and more trends, more and more things that employees want, and how do you actually, again, design things for them and really see this as a product. And I am honestly inspired by you and by Liveramps, thinking of that and how to see this and really thinking about employees as their biggest asset. And I think that's probably the biggest thing in remote work, is seeing this as, this is how we put people first. That's how I think about it. And really designing for that. Any other thoughts, comments that you would like to share with me, with us?
Yeah, well, you talked about this notion of kind of designing and understanding who your user is, and again, that's been such a powerful idea for the Liveramp team. And you also mentioned the notion of that it is a team, and it really is. So we have a people and culture organization, that includes folks who everything from benefits and our hiring effort and our learning effort and what have you. You wake up every day, and this notion of future of work is like a lens that they apply to everything that we have done and everything that we're thinking about doing for the future. And so I just absolutely affirm and acknowledge that there's a lot of folks behind, a lot of the learning and doing, that we've talked about today. And the second thing I would say on this notion of kind of user-centered design is again, we're still learning, but that's actually part of it, right? It's
definitely.
If
part of the fun.
we do not always get it right the first time, but we really believe, just like we do with our external facing product, that if we stay humble and we stay curious, and we empathize and understand our customers, and we link that back to what we're trying to do as a business, any places where we fall short of nirvana in the moment, will pretty quickly be outstripped by whatever we do with what we learned, right?
Definitely.
And so that's been that, and I'd say being able to communicate with that type of humility to our customers, which our 1,200 Liverampers worldwide, I think helps. Our folks have been heroic over the last year, and also I think incredibly understanding, in part because we do try to be very transparent about what we know and what we don't yet understand. And I think folks want to give each other the benefit of the doubt and some space to work things out together.
Completely agree. So thank you so much. Thank you for being an incredible guest in Coffee with Gable. Cheers.
Cheers. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Liza.
Bye.